Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started now. I'm Debbie Binkley. I'm the coordinator of gifted services in Gahanna Jefferson Schools. I have muted your microphones, so if you later on ask questions, you'll need to unmute them. I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Pat Fahrenkopf. Dr. Fahrenkopf and I have known each other for quite some time. When I started in Gifted a long, long time ago, she was also in Gifted, and she has been a valuable resource to me for a very long time answering my questions. And I know she'll have a lot to offer for us tonight and to be able to answer your questions. So Dr. Fahrenkopf, if you'd like to begin.
Wonderful, I sure would. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my video so you can focus on what we're doing with the PowerPoint. But I'm still here, okay? So the Transescent, that's the title of my session this evening. Its subtitle is To Go Across and Become Something. Speaker introductions are always best when connected to the topic. So I wanted to start with that because, you've been in sessions before and you're thinking about all of these other things that you are responsible for doing, or just hoping that you're going to get some questions answered through the session. So, I'm going to connect this for you by doing the following. I'm just going to tell you my own story. I have designed this introduction so that you can also think about your school days. So let me tell you a little bit about my elementary school. I went to Franklin Elementary School. It was grades K through 8 at the time. That was from 1956 through 1965, and I was 4 years old at the start of kindergarten. The program there was elementary, and then after elementary, grade 8, we would go straight into high school. And when I was in 6th grade, we had a new addition to our building, and it included grades 7 and 8. And so it was like we were attending junior high school. And I thought that was pretty cool. And I was really, really looking forward to going to high school. So my next slide takes you to Wilbur Wright High School, and that was grades 9 through 12. That was from 1965 through 1969, and I could not wait to get to high school. However, the experience was not what I had built up in my mind, and I had different ideas. I answered questions in class differently, and I was quite frankly seen as weird by my classmates. So it really wasn't the experience that I had so looked forward to. And so what I did was I decided to be pretty quiet during the school day, but I also decided to find some other activities for after school groups in which I could immerse myself. And I did that. I immersed myself in junior achievement. I became the president of my company. And then I also attended the Youth Traffic Safety Council and became their vice president. And so I was kind of finding my leadership identity at the same time as finding my voice after school. So that's how I survived high school. And then college, I was 17 years old as a freshman. I attended Miami University of Ohio from 1969 through 1973. And I was not prepared to study, and I learned strategies from a friend in the dining hall. That's how I learned how to study. I had sailed through high school, didn't really have to do too much work, and really didn't know how to study. And so my sophomore, junior, and senior years were much better GPA wise. I also want to mention that I met my future husband at Miami of Ohio. Actually, I had met him at high school, and we were actually born in the same hospital 5 days apart, but we didn't get married until later in life. So life does have an interesting way of coming around and about. So my story also includes parenting. transcendence in adolescence. I have two children, and they're no longer children. They are adults, and they have children of their own. My son was the oldest. My daughter was so different. I thought they would at least have some similarities, and they do look alike even today, but that's where the likenesses ended. So I was amazed that they were so different, even though I parented pretty much the same, I thought. My story also involves teaching transcendence and adolescence. I moved from teaching 5th grade self-contained to 7th grade mathematics. And I interviewed with a principal who at the time asked me the question, do you think that this is something that you are suited to do, teach at the middle school level? And I naively said, of course I could, that there was only a 2-year difference between grade 5 and grade 7, but I was surprised at how different the middle school was from the elementary. But I really loved it. I found my true love at middle school level. And I continued in the same district by developing and teaching a gifted program for grades 3 through 8. And I continue to be delighted with the middle school age students. We did projects like Olympics of the Mind, which became Odyssey of the Mind, which became Destination Imagination. And what's interesting is these students that you see are now parents, and in some cases grandparents, and our Facebook friends, and connected with me, talking about their own children having gifted education experiences very much like the ones they experienced at London City Schools. My own story also includes the Martin W. Essex School for the Gifted and Talented. It started at Ohio State University, and at that time, in 1976, it started, and at that time, later on, I was the on-site director, and it was completely funded by the state legislature, which was just incredible. However, in 2009, the funding was pulled, and Essex had to move to a new location, and that was Otterbein University, which is where I currently live in Westerville. And so we were there for 10 years, and then last year we moved to Ashland University, which is where I am on faculty at the College of Education. And I am the co-director of that experience. And I do want to point out that this experience will be virtual again this year. The dates are June 19th through 24th. If you have a current freshman, sophomore, or junior who will be a sophomore, junior, or senior in the school year 2022-2023, then we want to talk to you. We want to see if your student would like to be part of our Essex School at Ashland University. Again, it will be virtual, and we will have a day in October of 2022 when we will bring the students to the Ashland University campus so they can have a tour and hear some speakers and meet each other in person. So I wanted to make sure that I gave you that information. And again, if you need more information, you can Google Ashland University Essex, and you will find our page. So my own experience, again, really involved researching gifted transcendence in adolescents. In 2014, I did complete my dissertation, was the Mirror of Erised, exploring identity development in gifted students. And I did have transcendence as my group that I interviewed. And then in 2020, I decided to do a follow-up study to my dissertation. I found all of those students who had been transcendents in 2013-14, and they were getting ready to graduate from high school. And interestingly enough, I started my follow-up study with them in March of 2020. I will pause just for a minute and let that sink in, because what happened was I did my first interview in person, and the very next day, COVID shut all of us down. So I had to pivot my research to online and email, Zoom, phone conversations. And I am going to publish my article, summary article, next February. Well, it will be in February next month. And it will be in the SAGE research methods, the online methods for research. So I'm really excited about that. And I've just continued to research those transessents and adolescents as they go from one stage to the next. So basically the question is, what is a transessent? And basically the prefix trans means to go across, and the suffix essent means to become something. And so these are young people in transition from childhood to adolescence. And of course, adolescence is the next stage. And many of you are probably parents of adolescents who will be going into adulthood then in their 20s. But we know that they are experiencing extreme changes, physically, intellectually, neurologically, emotionally, and also socially. So our presentation perspectives this evening will be acknowledging the importance of frames of reference. You know, I think this cartoon kind of captures that. As adults, we say, nah, maybe no, it's not, because what we are seeing is it's not. And the perspective of the child is, well, it's deep. So that's something that we keep in mind with when we take a look at frames of reference. We're organizing tonight's content as follows. You know, I want to talk a little bit about who came up with the term transessent. I want to share those variables that you need to keep in mind when you're taking a look at this stage of development. Vantage points, again, from whose perspective? Is it the student's perspective, or your child's perspective? Is it the adult perspective, the parent perspective? You'll see different things depending upon your vantage point. I have some real life stories that will illustrate some ways that we can address some of the concerns that our gifted transessents and adolescents share with us. Finally, there'll be advice. And I want to promise you that it is much shorter than you probably fear right now. It's not going to be a whole list of things that you need to do, just some things that you need to remember. And also some resources. I also didn't give you a lot of resources, but I do want to give you some that I find are particularly helpful and useful and current, because this pandemic that we're going through it has really redefined what parenting is all about. I think you would agree. So who came up with the term transessent? It was Donald Eichhorn. And there's a picture of Donald. And he was really the 1960s pioneer. He was inventing schools for transessents. And he started by really taking a look at the need that junior high schools that included ninth grade really did need to make a switch so that they would send the ninth grade back to high school, and they would focus on the other middle grades. And that did finally turn in the 1970s into middle schools and the National Middle School Association. So really by the time the 2000s hit, most junior high schools were really making the switch to the middle school concept. So keeping this in mind, you know, you want to know how are transessents and adolescents more different from each other than they are alike, because believe me, they are. I found that out with my own children. I found that out with the children that I have I've taught, and also that I have had at the Essex School. So those ages really vary. So the early stage is about 10 through 14. The middle is 15 through 17. Late is 18 through 19. But keep in mind that those rates of physical, social, emotional, and cognitive changes do vary from classmate to classmate, also from sibling to sibling, as I found out with my own two children. And keep in mind, and you'll see this in a minute, I want to show you how the brain is actually changing. There are also differences in generations, absolute differences in generations. But let's start with the brain first. The brain variable, major remodeling is happening during this period, this time period. The brain develops from back to front. And so there's an actual pruning process of gray matter that happens during transescence and adolescence. It's so that there can be increased efficiency of the power of the brain. There are a couple of places in the brain that are interesting to keep in mind too. The amygdala, right in the center, is the risk-taking central. It's fight or flight. And the hippocampus is really all about new memories and learning. And sometimes the amygdala and hippocampus don't really get along. The prefrontal cortex, and I want to point that out too in the diagram you see right here. That prefrontal cortex is where executive functioning lives. And I know sometimes that is a concern that parents have and teachers have, that students have a different organizational system perhaps, and it sometimes cannot be useful for them. But the prefrontal cortex is not developed until the age in the mid-20s. So really, that's something that is constantly developing and not really mature until they're out of school, at least out of K-12 school. So that's something important to keep in mind. And it's just important to know, again, there's remodeling going on, and we have to excuse the appearance. We have to excuse the process. We just have to make sure that that's something that we provide for our students who are going through this extreme change. To give you an example of the brain variable, and the amygdala and the hippocampus and the prefrontal lobe, it's just like when a teenager gets his license and he's in a car, he's on the way to some event, maybe a football game, and is driving at a safe speed, and then up ahead he sees there's a traffic light that's just turned yellow. So rationally, we know what should happen. The car should slow down. You should prepare to stop. But again, that's rational. And sometimes being a teenager, they may have the amygdala kick in and they floor the gas and they accelerate to beat the light. And, hopefully everything is safe and there are no accidents. But you wonder, well, what just happened inside that brain? The light changed and the amygdala got really excited about the possibility of outracing the yellow light. And so the yet to be fully developed frontal lobe doesn't have the capacity to assist that young man in thinking rationally about the decision to beat the light. And it's not going to do him any good because he can't control that impulse to mash his foot down on the accelerator. The amygdala is taking care of that. So the next time that this happens, the hippocampus hopefully will weigh in with the learning from that experience, and the gas will not be punched and the light will turn red and the car will stop. So that's an example of the brain variable. Something I wanted to point out too is generationally, certainly my experience generationally is not your experience, because you weren't a baby boomer. So I would say you're in one of the other categories of generations. And again, to keep in mind, your experience is not your tweens or teens experience generationally, especially with the current generation and the technology and the constant changing and redirection that is occurring in our world. That has a great impact on what the view is of our world. And the variables then for gifted youth include some other kinds of things that we need to keep in mind. I think all of you may have heard of asynchronous development, and if you haven't, that's fine too. Asynchronous development in gifted is basically, they may be thinking at a really high level, but much more than their chronological age. And sometimes their physical and emotional development is at their chronological age level or even less. So, this can result in some isolation, social isolation. They can be seen as different or odd, or they can be rejected by others. So, it's just something to keep in mind that that's a variable for our gifted youth when they're going through adolescence. Intensity is also something that is a variable that, all people have intensities, but with gifted, there are differences in degree and duration. They may have really, really super high energy levels. They may be really sensitive to things like tastes and smells. They may have an emotional overexcitability, so that they don't just like things, but they really love areas where they're very interested in pursuing. So that, again, those emotions, their intellectual and imaginational sensitivities, their psychomotor, their sensual overexcitabilities, all of those things do have an impact then on their identity development. Sometimes gifted students, gifted youth, gifted transessents, gifted adolescents are perfectionists, and they really set incredibly high standards for themselves and for others. And it's really hard for them to accept anything other than perfection. And if they are producing something less than perfection, sometimes they see themselves as a failure or an impersonator, or they can underachieve. They can just decide that they're not going to try it if they don't have a guarantee for perfectionism. And finally, this is really important for everyone, but it's particularly challenging for gifted students sometimes to find friends like themselves. You need to do this to have understanding and acceptance. And so, wherever you get that, that's something that you're searching for. Aristotle once said, what's another friend? It's another I. So you're trying to find someone who is like you, and sometimes that's kind of hard to find because there aren't too many people to see that who are like you. So something important to mention is variables from the pandemic. This is a period of time that we have been living through that has really given us a different view of what being a transessent or an adolescent is like. There's increased impatience with uncertainty regarding if school will be live or virtual, when they'll be eligible for the vaccine. There are all of those things that are the unknowns, and I think we're all impatient there. So I think that's something that we can all understand. Global problems. Many times gifted students feel powerless to solve things like supply chain interruptions and climate change impacts and diseases without a cure. And they want to do that, but they feel really helpless. So that's something that we need to keep in mind as a variable. Burnout is something that we're seeing, those mental health issues because of overtiredness due to lack of sleep, worrying about what students are seeing happen on the news, and they're very restless about that. And so that burnout is something that we really have to take a careful look at. And also control issues, not being able to be as independent as before the pandemic. So these are the things that we have to keep in mind when we take a look at that transessent. Now, again, the vantage point is important to see from the transessent perspective. It's important to walk a mile in someone else's shoes or sandals or flip-flops. And so, what does this stage look and feel like to the tween or the teen? Identity development is really important. And I think I mentioned again, that was the focus of my dissertation. Identity refers to our sense of who we are as individuals and also as members of a social group. So one of the things that is important to remember is that identity is very dynamic and complex, and it changes over time. So it can start in childhood and go through the adolescent stage and then into the adulthood, but it will change during that time, and there'll be different reasons it will change. There'll be internal reasons, and there'll also be external forces that will be completely out of our control. One of the things that I used for my dissertation was an article by Frank and McBee about the use of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone to discuss identity development with our gifted adolescents. And when you take a look at the character development in Harry Potter, those three individuals are gifted individuals, and they are very different from each other. And they find each other, they find their acceptance and their friendship, and they support each other through many of the series episodes. So I wanted to point out that that mirror of Erised is something that Harry Potter used when he was trying to, find out his identity, who his parents were, who he was, and who he was going to become. So it was very symbolic of that identity development. So identity is very dynamic and complex. The development of a strong and stable sense of self is central. Adolescence is the first time that individuals begin to think about how identity may affect their lives. They are much more self-conscious about their changing identities at this time than at any other stage in their lives. So self-identity refers to how we define ourselves. In adolescence, the way we see ourselves changes in response to peers, to family, to school, and among other social environments. Social identity is constructed by others and may differ from self-identity. So it has to do with the need to belong. So the sense of self is very important. Positive self-identity is correlated with positive self-esteem. The tween-teen identity is not understood and equally valued by society. Accepting who you are is very important. Something else that I used for my dissertation, which was just amazingly helpful, was the gifted identity formation model. And the author of that is Andrew Mahoney, and he actually counsels gifted students and their families. He also has a new FIT program, which is specifically for gifted students to help them realize their potential and to discover those areas of investigation that they need to partake. It's an amazing story. Andrew Mahoney actually had an identity when he was very young that was supported by his family, and he loved art. And when he went to school, he was teased about that, and so he decided to put that away, and eventually he became a counselor. And so when he was doing his practicals with counseling, there was another person who helped him discover this art love that he had from his childhood. And so he rediscovered that. And so now he's got an identity of not only a counselor of gifted individuals, students, and their families, but also as an artist. And he has a website that is incredible. So if you Google his name, you'll be able to find some of his art. It's really incredible. But again, that was a journey that he took from childhood all the way up through to adulthood. So the vantage point, how does it look to the adults? How does it look to parents? How does it look to teachers? And we've talked about asynchrony, and this is often the first observation that adults have, is that there's a fluctuation of emotions and behaviors everywhere from, as this cartoon says, 3rd grade all the way to 12th grade. So There's quite a fluctuation that can occur, and that is particularly concerning sometimes, but it really shouldn't be because it's absolutely normal. Asynchrony is normal. So as parents, we may ask the question, well, so where did my child go? Whether we like it or not, kids change. Kids can suddenly lose interest in the things they used to play with. Literally, one day your child is playing with dolls, and the next they want to wear nail polish. They may be playing with trucks one day, and the next day they want the latest technology. So emotions and boundary testing behavior is observed as they explore and assert personal identity, and they learn to navigate peer relationships and transition to independence, which is our next topic. So independence is really a big topic for transessence and adolescence, because as a child, they have been pretty dependent, and now they're ready to try new things. They're ready to take on more responsibility. They're ready to make decisions by themselves, and they're ready to work out who they are and what they want to be. So achieving independence is a really essential part of this journey. And this reminds me of a friend's conversation one time who said to me, you know, my son has always been with me and gone places. We've always gone places together, but all of a sudden the conversation switched to, Dad, I'm meeting my friends at the mall. Can you drop me off at the door? And I think this cartoon is particularly reflective of what happens with that independence. On one hand, they really want to be independent, and on the other hand, they know they have to depend on you for that lift. Now there's some time for real life examples that I'd like to share. Going back to the characteristic that gifted have of worrying about global issues and feeling helpless to solve them, I wanted to share this story. We're not going to take the time now to take a look at the video because it's pretty lengthy, but I do have a link here, and it's CBS News. And if you Google the Farm Link project, you'll be able to see this this video of these young people who there were really three of them. There was a boy named Ben and James and Aiden, and they launched this project. It's a nonprofit, and what it does is it connects farms with food that they're going to throw away, that has been deemed maybe something that they don't want to send to stores, but they can send it to food banks and really address the food insecurity problem that we have in the United States. It currently now operates out of the Los Angeles warehouse, but the real interesting piece of this article that I found was that the two students who were interviewed talked about how they were really close since middle school, and that they had worked together on many tough projects, really, really unusual and interesting projects, you know, and they said that this is why their friendship stayed really strong. They love to do those projects, and they love to do them together. I think it's interesting that they say it was always annoying to our parents, but then they did get older, and they're, you know, able now to put some of those ideas into motion, and they're taking a look at the science of it. You know, the one student said, you know, if food waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. Again, they're impacting climate, and they're impacting that need to feed people who are hungry. And so instead of the farmers throwing away unused food, they are taking those and moving them to food banks so that they can really make a difference in the world and save that global issue. Here's another story that's really interesting too. This was a problem in a small New York town when the COVID hit, and there was an EMT shortage. And so these high school students came to the rescue. So it was something they could do. And that was in Sackett's Harbor, New York. they had a local volunteer ambulance service that would respond to calls, but many of them were off because of COVID. Either they were ill or they decided that they really did not want to risk the job responsibility. And so the high school students decided to look into the required training. They took it, and then they picked up the slack. And again, this is something that was reported by Steve Hartman, and if you Google that, you'll be able to see that article and the video. It's really interesting to hear the students talk about how many of them found a new love of helping others through the medical field. And so I think there was quite a difference that was made for them, as well as for the little town that they serve as the EMS for. So this is an example of a project from SANG. SANG is support the emotional needs of the gifted, and I've got an email address for you to take a look at that a little closer. I think it's really important for you as a parent to know that that's a resource that you can turn to, because they do a lot of parent groups, and it really helps you understand that social emotional piece of gifted that's very important to understand. But what they did was they decided to create the World Hope Project, and they empowered gifted youth because they knew that they felt very deeply about global issues, and they wanted to give them a voice. So this is the story of the World Hope Project. There are actually students, gifted youth, ages 8 through 17 from 27 countries, and their mission is all about sharing messages of hope and ideas for positive social change. It just gives them a voice. And there have been spin-off projects as well. So in that height of COVID-19, the 11-year-old that's described here from Japan decided to start his own organization to raise money to support the community during the pandemic. And so he does have a video interview that you can Google if you go through the SANG site. Also, Alberto from Chile initiated a class cleanup day in a local park. All of these things, again, were perhaps something on a smaller scale, but something that made a difference, something that was able to be done by those students who decided they had identified a problem and they wanted to be part of the solution instead of continuing the problem. So finally, we are at the point where we're going to take a look at some advice. We promise that it will be something that you'll be able to use, and it won't be too long, but we'll give you some ideas. And I think this first most important advice is something that I would guess all of you already know and you're doing. And that advice is to show teens that we love them no matter what, because it can be really frustrating sometimes. It can be frustrating to be the teen. It can be frustrating to be the parent. So that is something that, unconditional love is really important to show. Another piece of advice that I think is really worthy in a lot of cases is that whole habit of listening first to understand, and then to be understood, to be able to respond, but understanding it first. It's important to see things from different viewpoints, and listen without interrupting. And the benefit of that I would like you to think about and consider is it's something that I learned. It gives you time as an adult to decide how to approach issues that have maybe just been presented to you on the spot. So it's really important to do that listening before you respond. So remember that you as parents, you're key. This is a very important time of growth and reflection, and you're there, you're present. Your presence means everything. being aware of the stages of emotional development and demonstrating that unconditional love is just the underlying piece of advice here. Acknowledging when to give space and independence is also important to keep in mind and decide. Helping guide transessents and adolescents to feel good about themselves. Find those good pieces that really need to be examined and highlighted. And then modeling importance of sleep, nutrition, and exercise. It's really true that students watch what we're doing. Our children watch what we're doing all the time. And when we model that we think sleep is important, that we think nutrition is important and exercise is important, it goes a lot farther than any kind of direct advice that we would give them about their sleep and their nutrition and their exercise. So modeling that good behavior is really something that is key, that we as the adults in their lives can provide them. Last but not least, I want you to think just for a minute about the difference between influence and control. Probably a subtitle to this would be deciding how to pick your battles. So let's take a look at two different kinds of situations. Active rebellers and passive rebellers. So if you have an active rebeller, sometimes this child can get in your face, can argue with you about ridiculous expectations or rules. Those passive rebellers are the ones that I'm always concerned about. They just kind of are quiet. They wait until you're not around, and then they just go ahead and do what they wanted to do to begin with. So again, I think it's much better to know where our children are coming from as far as their questions and their actions. It's very important too to know the difference between the active and the passive, and the motivation behind it, and also the at-risk behaviors that can come from it. Rebel or robot, that's not the only option, two options, but those are definitely two things that we see. And knowing that teenagers test limits doesn't make the risky behavior any easier. I think we can all agree on that. That's the concern that we have, is that risky behavior. And that goes back again to that amygdala, that changing brain. So if we choose to be lovingly clear about our expectations and establish those with our children, that's what we need to do. We need to talk about natural and logical consequences of choices. And again, modeling is much more effective than lecturing. It really does show them that we value a particular value, and so they should be thinking about the same in their lives. Encouraging and modeling a wide variety of social network friends. This can be through a variety of venues: sports, church, community, family activities, all of those ways that social networks can be developed. Sometimes peer influence does feel like to the child that they need to either do those risky things or somehow say why they're going to opt out. And if they opt out, they want to do so without losing credibility. So, sometimes helping them think of ways to opt out is a very effective way to support your teen or tween. And let your child know a text message can be sent anytime they find themselves in an unsafe situation and they need to be picked up. Because again, those are the concerns we have, are those times when they are independent and out of our line of sight. So it's important to do something that teachers do oftentimes when they're helping to teach a new academic or creative skill. It's something called gradual release of responsibility. And that's when, we can scaffold the experience and gradually release responsibility to them. We foster a communication with our children of trust, and we influence, in other words, the ability to persuade kids to believe in something for themselves is much stronger than control. When it gets right down to it, as long as you're connected to your child, you have influence. So when your transescent or your adolescent is on their own, whether it's at that party, whether it's at that trip with friends, whether it's with their boyfriend or girlfriend after the prom, influence is really what we have working for us with our transescent and adolescent. I wanted to go through a couple of resources that I think are very important. First of all, organizations. Know about these organizations. The one that I've given you that I definitely think you need to connect to is the Ohio Association for Gifted Children. That's the Ohio Association for Gifted Children. It is our way to connect parents and coordinators and teachers and students themselves with resources that our association has. And I think it's something that is important to know happens in the fall with the conference. There's a fall conference. There's a parent day that's on the Sunday before the conference starts. And it's really inexpensive. It's $5 to attend. And there are wonderful speakers, and it's a good way to keep up with some of the newest research and ideas in gifted education for parents and for others who are adults in their lives. There is a National Association for Gifted Children. They're going to be having a conference in November of 2022. And the good thing is it's going to be in Indianapolis, which is really close. So that's something you might be interested in taking a look at least interested in taking a look at what the program is offering. And I did mention supporting the emotional needs of the gifted. That's called SENG, S-E-N-G. And that is something that is a wonderful organization. They have conferences, they have supports for parents. And again, those emotional concerns of gifted are very important to address. And so that is a good place, good resource for you to keep in mind. My pick for book for parents is The Parent's Guide to Gifted Teens, Living with Intense and Creative Adolescents. It was published in 2010, but it is very, very good at taking a look at the basics. I do have some other references for you that are a little more recent, but this book is so good, I would recommend that you have that on your shelf. Book for teens is the Gifted Teen Survival Guide, and it's written for teens. So it's a book that your teen or tween could use. And then a book for both that I think is really important is one that our gifted coordinators of Central Ohio used as a book talk this past year. And it is brain-based learning with gifted students. So all of those things that I talked about that were being reconstructed or remodeled in the brain during this time of teens and tweens, this book is really good at addressing the reason for that for parents and for teachers to understand, but also has some great activities for students. So this book is really a good resource for both. And so I do have some other resources for parents and for teens. They are more recent, and I would like to point out the publications for the Big Life journals. That's the Growth Mindset Kit for Teens. Many times we hear about growth mindset, but most of the materials are for elementary students. What I like about these Big Life journals is they have one specifically for teens, and they also have a teaching guide that goes with it. So the kit is for teens, but then the teaching guide again is for parents and for teachers so that they can use these the best way possible. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing and ask if you have questions.